Does this work? Sounds like it.
Hey, everybody. So I will, I guess I'll introduce myself first. Joe, I thought there was going to be someone up here with us.
No, this is a conversation.
Okay, that's fine. So my name is Derrick Mcgill. I am the Director of Marketing at a company called Praxis. So I've been working in the sort of alternative education space, entrepreneurship development space for the last 3.5 years or so. What we do, and really I would say our sort of underlying philosophy is build your own credential, and that's what we're really focused on, is helping people sort of navigate around the traditionally entrenched structures of value signaling and expertise certification, and show them how to do that without necessarily going through these third parties. How to demonstrate value in the real world, how to signal it in a way that actually gets you opportunities. So I think this relates a lot to what's going on both in Puerto Rico and around the world, particularly outside of the United States, where some of these sort of entrenched certification structures are maybe even more culturally prevalent than they are in the US. So we'll hopefully talk a little bit about that, and I'm happy to also answer questions about my work as well.
Great, and I'm Michael Strong. I've been involved in the startup societies movement. I think I coined the term startup cities in 2012. I was involved in Honduras in the first phase, and still a little bit involved. I am also a lifelong education entrepreneur. I'm currently the founder and head of the Academy of Thought and Industry, a chain of innovative secondary schools with campuses opening in San Francisco, Austin, and New York this year, and we'll probably have 5 to 10 more. We focus on an innovative approach to personalizing education. So instead of having the student be pushed through a curriculum, we're student first, and we customize program around the student. We've actually had, I've had a couple of students go through Praxis, and so I'm very interested in creating market relevant and student relevant education as opposed to education that is simply for the sake of perpetuating institutions. And presumably we'll go a lot more deeply into that, so I won't go into it at great length now. Back to you, Era.
Yeah. Well, so, I guess we're here to talk about specifically rebuilding Puerto Rico, and sort of cultivating a culture of self-directed education, entrepreneurship, innovation. I would say one of the maybe Michael has some more to say about this, but one of the fundamental insights that I've had working with Praxis is that this needs to be market-based. Like, I don't think that education can be, in general, properly delivered in a non-market-based setting. I think having a profit incentive involved, having customers that are accountable to paying you, and having people that are accountable to delivering a specific product makes the product better all around. One of the things that I experienced certainly in college, and I think a lot of us have experienced in the sort of traditional schooling system, is that lack of accountability, that sense in which you're part of this really big institution that doesn't necessarily really care about individual results. They care about sort of aggregate results. A market-based system where you have individual customers paying you, that puts the power back in the hands of the customer in a really meaningful sense. So I'm not sure, specifically about what Joe mentioned earlier, kind of about this needs to be specifically about Puerto Rico. It certainly does, but I think it also needs to be about the entrepreneurs creating these solutions need to be in it for profit too. I don't think coming in with some kind of specifically altruistic motive is going to be enough.
So I'm going to kind of go bigger picture. Some of you probably read Brian Kaplan's book, Against Education. The way I see it, there is evidence now that the only domains in which post-secondary education results in a positive ROI are either STEM fields or elite degrees. So sure, if you go to Harvard or Stanford and work for McKinsey, you get a positive ROI on your education. And sure, if you're an engineer, you can go off and get a positive ROI. But most forms of post-secondary education at this point, especially if you include opportunity cost, do not result in a positive ROI. And yet we're still sending lots of kids to college. Going back even to high school, in traditional societies at the age of, say, 13, puberty, you were an adult. You know, a young man would go out and hunt his first deer, and you're part of the adult community. And we evolved such that you were expected to take on great responsibility at the age of 12 or 13. Right now, well, some kids, you know, there's a certain percentage of students for whom school works. Gallup poll shows that in the United States, 56% of American high school students are disengaged. And so whenever I hear debates about how to improve education in the United States, I always want you to think Beavis and Butthead in the back of the classroom. Like, for me, it's just insane, all these debates about how to improve it, when the reality is most kids are just no effing way. It's perfectly irrelevant. It's sort of like the Far Side cartoon where you're talking at your dog and the dog just hears his name and just blah, 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 blah. You know, the disconnect between the reality and the classroom, and I've been around the world, I've been in schools and around the world, you know, especially at the high school level. Elementary school kids, maybe you can, you know, teach them, but at high school, kids want to be doing their own thing, and if you create an irrelevant secondary education, you've lost them. Again, I think most of the people who replicate the education system were from that 20% who actually went to school and liked it. We got good grades, most of us. Maybe some of us not, but most of us, you know, the system works. I was great at memorize and forget tests. A total waste of time. But what we don't remember, we and all the policy wonks who replicate the system, is that this is perfectly irrelevant to most kids. Meanwhile, what is valuable? I'll go back kind of market-driven. Chains like General Assembly. General Assembly is a global chain, for-profit chain that educates people in 21st century skills. Software design, UX design, graphic design, video production. Right now, there are not enough UX designers in Austin. So there are a lot of $100,000 jobs in Austin that are going empty because we don't have an adequate pipeline of great UX designers. Meanwhile, you get a degree in Harvard in English and you're perfectly worthless on the job market. Maybe you can get a job at Starbucks. So why is it that we're not training 13-year-olds to be UX designers? Why not train Puerto Rican 13-year-olds to be UX designers? And so what does that kind of mean to have real, serious, market-driven, market-relevant, almost more market-relevant education? So first of all, what some people hear is like, oh, let's train kids how to, code HTML or something, or let's train them how to use Final Cut Pro. The fact is, learning to use the tools is maybe 5% at most of the path. And there are public schools that have a class in video production. Good for them. But what you really need is to learn how to be an adult professional. And for that, you need something more like contact with real-world adult professionals. Insofar as kids are in school, even if they're taking a video production class or a coding class, it's a game. For most of them, it continues to be a meaningless game. So in terms of market-relevant education, we need to be able to create in Puerto Rico classes and courses and schools and institutions that are not only for-profit but directly relevant to the market, and ideally that include apprenticeships, on-the-job learning. You're actually working with employers. We need pipelines of effective professional talent. And once we have some kids, the great thing about kids is they learn really fast. If you give them something relevant to learn, they learn really fast. And by the way, scolionormative, my new word of the year. Scolionormative means if you're good at school, you're considered smart. If you're not good at school, you're considered dumb. There are kids who are brilliant at video production who might be getting D's and F's. There are kids that are brilliant at UX design that could be getting D's and F's. This is totally orthogonal to the good at school thing. We need to take really bright, motivated kids who may be brilliant in something that's market relevant, and we need to give them options, say at 13, to have develop market relevant skills with adult professionals. And then we need to see them getting jobs at 15, 16, 17. Mike Gibson, who's one of the founders of the 1517 Fund that invests in young entrepreneurs, was asked what is an unpopular belief he believes in, and he said child labor. And of course he's being provocative. We're not going to send kids back into the coal mine, but we need to give 13, 14, 15-year-old kids the opportunity to work alongside real software developers and real UX designers and real restaurateurs and real welders and things like that. And insofar as school prevents us from doing that, insofar as labor law prevents us from doing that, we need to do whatever we can so that these kids can be on the ground working with great mentors, developing world-class skills. One of the things I tell kids coming into my school's $40,000 a year, very high end. So right now, rich kids can get market-relevant education. Poor kids are still stuck in those worthless schools. Sorry about the harshness, but it just drives me crazy. But I tell them, you want to get started on your 10,000 hours now. Malcolm Gladwell popularized the notion that to become world-class in something, you need 10,000 hours. So if you're going to be the world's greatest chef or the world's greatest, carpenter or whatever it is, you need to have an aspiration for world-class excellence. You need to be trained by somebody who can get there, and you need to get started on 10,000 hours of practice ASAP. So why wait till you're 22, you have a bunch of college debt, you've been bored in school, you're passive for most of the most important years of your life, and all of a sudden, maybe when you're 25, you start on your 10,000 hours? No. Age 13, let's get rocking and rolling, very serious. And the more in Puerto Rico we can create market-relevant, market-driven education so that these kids can get great jobs ASAP, the more prosperity and opportunity we'll find there.
That was great. I mean, I'm in total agreement about the fact that this also needs to begin much earlier. So, Praxis, we're taking people who are typically 17 to 26 years old. We're putting them in an apprenticeship program, and that's really, currently the audience that we serve. But we've experienced the very, real-world effects of an audience of people who have grown up in the traditional schooling system and have no skills or ability or really understanding of how to deal with the real world. So we have, about 200 people or so join the program every year. That's about 5 to 10%, really lower than 10%, of their actual applicants. And there's a reason for that. It's because so many people are just, even for our program, just unprepared for it. They're not ready because they've gone through that traditional system. I think preparing people at a much earlier age and helping them get that experience, that's going to be crucial, whether it's in the US or whether it's in Puerto Rico. It can't just be done at the collegiate level. It needs to be done at a much, much earlier level. Michael actually shared some funny statistics on Facebook the other day that maybe he can elaborate on too if he knows any more about it. But I think that highlights the consequences of the tool-centric approach to work, or tool-centric approach to education, which is you're going to go into the classroom and you're going to learn how to do Photoshop, or you're going to learn how to edit. That's so unimportant compared to the broader stuff of being able to deal with the world as a professional, being able to deal with people who are older than you, being able to work with people of different backgrounds and different experience levels, and being able to navigate that in a creative and entrepreneurial way. So the statistics were I think it was 40% of employers reported that among their millennial employees, their parents had contacted the office or something like that. And there were some other crazy statistics as well, but for me, that's the most damning thing about this tool-centric approach. You got these kids who may or may not learn a hodgepodge of skills in the classroom, but then they leave that classroom and they still cannot deal with the world in any meaningful sense. So if you want to begin addressing these issues, these kids need to be getting work experience at a much, much earlier age. And it doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time job, but an opportunity where you're shadowing someone for part of the day, where you're taking on creative projects, where you're just getting your hands in the mix, doing whatever it is. It really doesn't matter at that age, just getting something where you're producing something of value in the real world. And I talk to a lot of homeschoolers who are 13 to 16 years old. A lot of them don't necessarily, have an immediate opportunity given the, legislative environment for them to go out and actually get a job necessarily at that age. But, there's a lot of things you can do now with the internet and with, technology to actually kind of go out and sidestep all of those things. So I know kids who are 13, 14, 15 years old who run eBay stores and do product photography for their stores and manage the customer service on their stores. I know kids who set up Shopify stores. I know kids who run blogs. I know kids who connect with a community online and help put together a conference. The nice thing about the world we live in today, and I think this is totally applicable across the world, is that you do have internet connections, you do have the ability to actually sort of sidestep some of these regulatory things that would prevent you from doing traditional work and still engage in the market in a meaningful sense as a young person.
So I'm going to bump off that, and the one way I look at education is it's really about transmitting culture and networks. So most people, if you look at the education debates, everybody's talking about curriculum and pedagogy and textbooks and standards, and there's all this apparatus. And I think the apparatus that almost everybody talks about in education is almost entirely irrelevant. And what I'll talk about is kind of startup culture. So, I've created most recently schools in Austin and San Francisco, both of which have fabulous startup culture. My wife is from Senegal. We're trying to, how do you move startup culture to Senegal? Puerto Rico, how do you move startup culture there? And so if you compare 13-year-olds who are starting websites, running SEO search firms, I've had a young kid run an SEO search firm. I've had kids have paid clients as web developers and so forth. A lot of these young kids in these startup culture hubs, they're spontaneously making and creating great, very small, but great little companies when they're 13, 14, 15. You compare a kid like that in terms of their future opportunities with somebody, say, in Puerto Rico who's getting straight A's in their history classes and English classes. And I would stipulate the kid who's starting businesses and making money in the startup culture is way ahead professionally than the kid with straight A's in a conventional schooling system most places in the world, because what's invisible is this set of attitudes and the skills and so forth that people are learning as participating in the startup culture, as opposed to getting good grades in a regular system. Give you another example. I had a guy volunteer at my school who was a UX designer, and he was getting Fortune 500 contracts. And I asked him, why is it that Pizza Hut will pay you to do their UX rather than some guy in India for 1/50th of the cost? And he said, my skill is I know better than the client does what the client wants. And as an educator, I thought, okay, how do you teach a course in this is how to know better than the client what he wants? It's actually a pretty sophisticated sort of thing. But part of it is working with real clients. One of my students actually created a website for an American Idol finalist while he was 13. And at one point, the American Idol finalist fired my 13-year-old after 6 months, and it was really painful. But that process of building a website for a celebrity and then getting fired by the celebrity was probably better than anything you would have learned in any kind of regular academic course. Yeah. And so, they say in Silicon Valley, fail faster. You need kids getting out there, doing this, they need to figure out how to add value. Basically, got a friend named Charlie Hone, who used to be special products director for Tim Ferriss. And he says, the way to be sure you always have a job is to add more value than you're paid. And that is fundamental. And yet, I've never heard of a school really teaching that. You can imagine the attitude at school is you go through, you get your credentials, and then you're supposed to get a job. How many schools teach you that your number one goal is to add more value than you're worth, and then you will never be worried about having a job?
It's one of the core lessons that we teach our people at Praxis, and I'm totally agreeing with you. Like the structure of the actual curriculum itself is way less important than just getting your hands dirty and getting an actual work experience. And so Praxis, we do have a 6-month boot camp, but it's very flexible, and that really the goal is just to get you into that apprenticeship. We have a 6-month apprenticeship after that. You jump right into work. You're creating real value at a real company. You're getting paid to do it. You're learning on the job, frankly, all the stuff that you really can't learn in school. And you're learning to become a valuable employee in the process. One of the core lessons, though, that we found valuable, and it always staggers me just how little this is taught in traditional schooling. And I tend to think that if it's not in the United States, it's probably even magnified even more elsewhere. It's understanding the difference between what employers say they want and what they actually want. So there's an economic principle is express preferences and revealed preferences. Employers kind of across the board will say things on their applications like I want 3 years of experience and I want a BA in this subject, or something similar, or a BS in this subject. And kids will look at that and they'll say, okay, well I'm out because I don't have this, this one requirement, or I don't meet this checkbox. Instead of understanding what's the underlying desire that these employers are getting at when they have these requirements in place. And all they really want to know is this person's going to create more value than they take out in salary. Like, that's it. And so at Praxis, our whole goal is really showing people, here's how you signal that in the market without necessarily having to meet their expressed checkboxes. I've talked with a lot of kids all over the world who are stuck in this kind of vicious cycle of, trying to get opportunities and realizing they don't meet the checkboxes and then not knowing what to do next. I remember you referenced Charlie Hone. One of the things that Charlie did to get his job with Tim Ferriss when he didn't have a whole lot of experience and didn't know Tim Ferriss was to actually write an email to Tim Ferriss proposing his own job. And Charlie basically created, outlined 3 or 4 steps that would basically be his job for Tim Ferriss, his ideas for what Tim Ferriss could do to actually improve his business. And so suddenly Charlie had a job with a best-selling author that had probably received, over the years, thousands of people trying to work with him. And yet he was able to sidestep that entire process. Didn't matter whether he had a degree or not, didn't matter what his past experience was. All that mattered for Tim was that Charlie was bringing concrete, valuable ideas to the table. And that's, I think, the most important mindset that you can sort of instill in people if you want to get them to sort of take this approach to starting their work at a much earlier age is really understanding, look, you have to be able to be the one who goes out and comes up with the valuable ideas and brings them to the table if you want to be able to, to get a job and sort of sidestep the traditional credential process.
Very concretely, I know about 30, 40 interesting education organizations that are in the space. Praxis is certainly one of them. And in Puerto Rico, I would be happy to kind of add my contacts and help seed this. In some cases, we can talk these organizations into setting up shop in Puerto Rico. In other cases, we may be able to replicate their model with local entrepreneurs in Puerto Rico. One other example, App Academy is a highly competitive coding boot camp in San Francisco. I believe they're out now in New York, maybe Austin. No tuition up front. They take 17% of your first year's salary, but their average graduate makes over $100,000 in San Francisco. So it's tuition free because they can count on their graduates making good money. And there are a number of models like that that are actually tuition free, but because they have a track record of producing success, they are able to basically front the cost because they know they'll bring in money. So there are lots of these organizations. I would love to see sort of a concentrated educational ecosystem in our startup society there, or collectively, even if it's all over the island, I don't care where it is, even if part of it's virtually. And to seed a place where, most people most of the time will stick with conventional educational institutions. People are incredibly traditional when it comes to education. I think of it as a form of church. And so just like people love their local church, people love their local educational institutions. That's totally okay. As with everything, there are early adopters. I'm kind of on the crazy frontier of, crazy adopter side. But those are the kids we want. What we need is we need to seed the situation there with a few of these cool, innovative educational institutions, and we need a small number of initial kids. And once we have, these teenagers all of a sudden getting good jobs, getting good skills, having been part of the best, maybe new blockchain companies there, that will be a game changer, and then other people will follow along. And that is the other thing, is everybody in education wants this big mask. What's the right curriculum to change everything? Everything starts small. Apple started in jobs in Wozniak in a tiny garage. You start small, but you seed the right kind of stuff. This is not about changing the curriculum across Puerto Rico. It's about setting up a system where we have a few incredible winners, and those winners then exemplify the direction things need to go. So we need to have kids that you would never have thought doing great stuff. One other thing, the 1517 fund that finances teen entrepreneurs, they've got one company financed by that they finance from a teen entrepreneur now in his maybe 21, 22. It's almost $1 billion company. These things happen. So, start small, go in the right direction, and let's get a few incredible wins in the next few years, and then that will accelerate to be a game changer and will grow gradually.
Yeah. Sorry.